You may have seen it, but you didn't know what it was. This is the spiraling blanket stitch. You can cover the surface of your fabric collage in the spiraling blanket stitch and create amazing effects. Join me today and I'll show you how to create this stitch. You'll see the different effects you can get using dark or light colors, and you'll learn how you can stitch in different directions to create interesting effects, like creating depth, line, shapes, and so much more. I'm going to be using one of my bird templates, but you can use any shape that you want and get different effects. The possibilities are endless. I'm also going to show how to add a border using this same stitch and some options for highlighting or downplaying to create areas of interest. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. I'm starting with a piece of felt that's 3.5 by 4.5 inches. And I'm going to be using my large bird template, and I'm going to be using just the head and part of the chest. I'm going to be placing it just like this. I can also place it in the other orientation. So I'm just wanting the silhouette really of the head of the bird for this. This large bird template set is available in my shop, and it also comes as a PDF instant download. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out some fabrics, and I'm going to create a collage on this 3.5 by 4.5 base. So I'm pulling out some small scraps of fabric. I've got some greens and blues, some different shades of orange, and I have this piece of fabric, which is the fabric I'm using today as inspiration in terms of color. So I'm not going to use this whole piece of fabric. I'm going to cut a small piece of this, and the colors of the other fabric that I use are going to be inspired by the colors in this piece. So I'm going to trim this down, and then I'm going to start pulling in other fabrics and try and find a composition that I like. Then I'm going to be bringing in the silhouette of this bird, and I could use either orientation, but I'm keeping in mind that this bird's going to be the central focus. So I'm going to continue to play with these fabrics. So I want to pull some greens that go with the green leaf. I want to pull some blues that go with the blue, and some oranges, and maybe even red. I can even find an orange that's in between, and I don't have to match them exactly. This sort of orangey brown color that I've got here isn't an exact match, but it works well with these other colors. So I'm going to keep playing with them and moving them around. And I think I've come to an arrangement that I like. It's a very simple collage, and I like the way that the colors are working together. So now I'm going to base this collage down. I'm going to use regular sewing thread. I'm going to take small stitches on the front and big stitches on the back to secure down these fabrics. So now that they're held in place, I'm going to bring out my template, and I'm going to decide where to place it. When I turn the collage in the portrait orientation, I think I like the way that the bird is sitting in front of that collage. So I'm going to move it around and get the exact placement that I like, and then I'm going to trace it. I'm going to use a heat erasable pen for this. I use these friction pens. I have them in 2 thicknesses. Either one would work here. I'm going to use this purple one today. So I'm going to gently trace this, trying not to pull the fabric. And if necessary, I'm going to place marks on the fabric with dots if I feel like it's pulling too much, dragging that pen along. So I'm going to trace that shape. So there's my shape. There's one thing that I'm going to do to adjust this shape, and this isn't necessary, but I'm going to make the beak a little bit narrower. So I'm going to draw inside the lines where the beak is, and then I'm going to connect those lines up to the top of the head and the neck. And the reason I'm doing that is I think I want my beak to be a little bit thinner, a little bit pointier than it is. And you can see the template that I have the beak a little bit thicker, and that's to allow for seam allowances, and it allows this template to be used in many different ways. And in this case, I'm only tracing the shape and I don't need any seam allowances. So I think I like this thinner outline just for the beak. So now I'm going to come in with some black embroidery floss. I have 2 strands and I'm using an embroidery needle. So I'm just going to trace the shape with stitching. And I'm going to use the backstitch for this. So I'm starting a little ways from the edge and bringing my needle through. And that's because I don't want my knot to be too close to the edge. Then I'm going to stitch back towards the edge. And then I'm going to turn around and start moving along that line with the backstitch. So I move ahead of where my line is and I come out on the line and then I move back and I meet that line, putting my needle down right where it had come out previously to make a continuous line. And when I get to places where there's tight curves, I can make those back stitches smaller and just continue to trace that line all the way to the bottom. So now that I've stitched that line, I'm going to come in with my iron, place it over top of the stitches I made, and all the lines are going to disappear. I'm going to bring in a pouch that I've made using this same method. So here's my drawstring pouch. And if you want to see how to make one of those, I'm going to put a link in the description. It's a really fun project. And on this particular pouch, I had done something very similar where I had the head and part of the chest of a bird, and I had done the spiraling blanket stitch in black for the bird and white for the background. You can see how I did that as I started in the center where the eye is, and I started to spiral outwards. And then as I moved down, I stitched in the shape of a wing, and I'm going to flip it over so you can see I did the same thing on the other side with reverse colors. I created my bird in white and the background is in black. So you can really use any 2 colors for this. It looks really good if you have 2 contrasting colors, so a dark and a light. It doesn't have to be black and white. You could use red and white or black and red or any dark color, a dark blue, a dark green, and then a really light color. You could even use the same color and one in a dark shade and one in a light shade. So because the eye is the central part where we're going to start making the bird, I'm going to create the eye now. So I have my pen and I'm going to place the eye. And the way that I place the eye is I go straight across from where the beak is to about the middle of the head. And I make a small dot. And you can see when I stitch this one, I put a French knot right in the middle. And then I began my spiraling blanket stitch around that French knot. So I have my dot, and you can even draw a circle around where that dot is to mark where you're going to start your blanket stitching. So now I have my eye marked and I know where I'm going to start. Now you could start right away stitching your bird, or you can start in the background. Because I have this collage in the background and the fabrics that are held down with the basting stitches, I'm going to start with the background. I'm going to use white for my background today. And I'm going to start down at the very bottom of the bird. I'm going to bring my thread up. And I'm going to hold it with my left hand out of the way. And I'm placing my needle down right where that black line is that I've stitched. And then I'm going to bring my needle up about 1/4 inch away, straight up. Then I'm going to pull that needle through, and that's going to make a loop. And then I'm going to move to the right, placing my needle again right where the black line is, and coming up a similar distance away, trying to match the stitch that I made before, and then pull my thread through and make another loop. I'm just going to continue this way, moving over as little or as much as I like. It doesn't have to be the same, and it really doesn't have to be exact. I just move over a small distance, about 1/4 inch or less. And I take another stitch and I move along and I just keep taking stitches and I follow that black line, which is where I'm always going to put my needle down. And when you get into tighter spaces and you're turning corners, I'm going to place my needle even closer, but I'm still going to come out over that 1/4 inch or less. So it's sometimes going to make more of a triangular shape. I'm just following the shape of this bird, going around the beak, moving around the head, until I get to the other side. And then I take a stitch down and I tie off at the back. So there's my first round. To make my next round, I'm going to start at the bottom again. You can either come up inside your last stitch, or you can come out near it and then loop your thread around to catch that previous stitch. And my general goal here is to take a stitch in between the stitches of the previous row. So I put my needle down on that line, that bar that's going across from the previous row, and then I come up a distance away, about a 1/4 inch or less, and I make that loop. And I just keep going this way, following that shape. And I'm going to keep doing that until I hit the edge. So I've just completed my 5th row, and that has brought me right to the edge on the left. So now, instead of continuing all the way around, I'm going to go as far as I can on the left here and continue to make rows back and forth. And then I'm going to start up above where that edge is and do the same thing at the top, continuing with these rows and rows of the blanket stitch until the whole area is filled in. So there were 2 spots where the fabric started to pucker. So there's one other thing that I did. If I flip it over, you can see that I removed basting stitches and I added some new ones. And I did that in this upper corner because this fabric was starting to shift around. I really wanted to anchor it in place so they were nice and flat while I was doing these blanket stitches. So now I'm going to complete the stitching in white in these 2 areas, the one at the bottom and the top. And then I'm going to be ready to start stitching the black of the bird. So I've worked my way across the bottom, and now I just have a few more rows to do at the top. Because of all the stitching, some of that fabric has pulled in, and I can see that white felt right at the top right corner. So I'm going to take another piece of fabric, and this is a matching piece of orange fabric that already exists in my collage, and I'm going to tuck a small piece right over the top. And then I'm going to come in with regular sewing thread, and I'm going to baste it in place. And then I'll be able to do my blanket stitch right over top of that piece of fabric. And I should even be able to tuck the edges under the stitches that are already there if I need to. So I'm going to trim away the excess and stitch those last few rows. So I've finished my blanket stitching all the way up to the top, and I've integrated that patchwork piece. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the eye. I'm coming up right where I've marked that eye, and I'm going to create a French knot. And now I'm creating a circle around that eye. I've used the back stitch to stitch around it, and I've left a few millimeters of space in between the French knot and my circle. And now I'm looking at the circle I've created and I'm evaluating it, and I want to come in with one more row of tiny back stitches even closer to that French knot. And now I'm ready to start creating my spiraling blanket stitch around that circle around the eye. So I'm going to come up. You can start anywhere with this, and I'm going to take a stitch right down into that base of that circle, pull through that loop, and then I'm going to move over to the right and take another stitch. And I'm going to continue doing this all around this base circle. I'm not moving very far from where I'm putting my needle in, and I'm letting it come out on an angle. So these are more almost pie shapes that I'm making, and that's because I'm working around this small circle. So I need to take enough stitches that I can fill in that entire area. So I'm really moving over only a few millimeters from where I'm putting my needle in, and I'm coming out maybe double that amount where my needle's coming out, creating those wedge shapes. And then when I get to my first stitch, I'm going to pull it out to create the shape of that last stitch. So now I've completed one round. So before I continue with my spiraling blanket stitch, I'm going to come back to my eye and I'm going to fill in some of that black area. This is an optional step, and it really just depends on the look of the eye that you're going for. I'm feeling like this pupil is looking a little small, so I want to add more drama to that eye by adding more black right at the top. And you can see I didn't do that here for this pouch, and that's really just a matter of preference and the look you're going for. And here I'm looking at this eye and I just wanted it a bit bigger. So now I'm ready to continue with my spiraling blanket stitch. I'm going to come up just outside of where this stitch went in, and then I'm going to slip my needle under and I'm going to pull that thread up. And that's to create more of a round shape. And that's just the way that that stitch fell. I wanted to pull it out a little more. And now I can just continue with this spiraling blanket stitch. I'm going to put my needle down and bring it out, always creating that wedge shape. And this is something that you just do as you go around. You kind of decide where you want to put it. It's not a hard and fast rule that you must put one stitch in between every other stitch. It's really a matter of making that circle work and making sure that you're not making your stitches pull too much. You want to make sure you're continuing to create that round shape. So this is a time to not work quickly, to go really slow and be really deliberate about where you're putting your needle in and where you're bringing your needle out. So now I've worked all the way back to the beginning. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my needle in and pull that first stitch out, and then go straight down and pull that needle all the way through, and that's going to create that shape I want for that last stitch. And then I'm going to come back and continue with the third row. I'm coming outside again, slipping my needle under that stitch and pulling it up. And that's because I want to continue to make that nice round shape. And that helps put that stitch exactly where I want it to be. And then I'm going to do the same thing again, and I'm going to keep going with these spirals until I've filled in all the area. And so here at this row, I'm able to bring my stitch out right at the top of the bird's head. So this is going to be my final row going around the top. Everything will be filled in. So I'm putting my needle down in the last row and I'm bringing it up right in that stitching at the top of the bird's head. So everything matches up and it's going to be completely filled in. So I'm taking my final stitch. So that ended up being 3 rows, spiraling around that eye to fill in that top area of the head. So now what I'm going to do is start over on the right, and then I'm going to move my way all the way around and fill it in right up to the beginning of that beak area. So that's probably going to be 1 row. So I'm starting over here on the right, bringing my thread up, and I'm just going to work in that previous row, moving my way all the way around until I get to the top of the beak on the other side. So now that I've worked my way over to the top of the beak, I'm looking at the beak, and I think what I'm going to do is take a stitch down and come up, and I'm going to stitch a line to separate the top part of the beak from the bottom part of the beak. So I'm going to come up in the middle, and when I stretch my thread across, I like the way that looks. So I'm going to go ahead and take a stitch right down at the tip of the beak. Now, depending on how long this is, you may want to anchor that stitch in the middle or take 2 stitches, but this is working really well here. So now I'm going to continue filling in the rest of the body of the bird. Now I could just continue with the blanket stitch, filling in the whole body. But instead of doing that, what I want to do is create the illusion of a wing and a chest. And to do that, I'm going to stitch in different directions with my spiraling blanket stitch. First, I'm going to stitch 1 more row to create the beginning part of the neck of the bird. So to do that, I'm just going to go from one side to the other, and then take a look at my progress. So here's that one more row. The neck of the bird is looking really nice. So now I'm going to continue. I'm going to start doing some shaping here. So I'm going to start over on this one side, and I'm going to work some blanket stitches, making them smaller and smaller, and then connecting them, creating an angle. So that one row is only going to come about halfway across. So there it is. I've filled in that one part of the neck, and now I'm going to bring in my erasable marker, and I'm going to draw the line for where I want the wing to be. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to trace that line. So now I'm going to start creating the chest area, making a short row that stops where that line is. And I can continue working this way all the way down. But I think it's a good time to stitch that line. And that's going to give me something to stitch into as I create the rest of this chest. So I'm using the Backstitch. I'm going to stitch all the way down that line that I drew. And then I can go back and continue doing some rows on the chest, filling that in. So here's what it looks like, moving that blanket stitch all the way down and stopping at that line. And I'm going to fill that in all the way to the bottom. So now that I've filled in the chest, I'm going to work on the wing. And to make it look different than the rest of the stitching, I'm going to work in the other direction. So I'm going to use that line that I stitched as my base for where I'm going to come out and create the blanket stitch. So I've turned my piece and I'm working my way down that line with the blanket stitch. And you can see after the first row that it's starting to create the illusion of the wing. And then I'm just going to continue filling in those rows and working in that same direction until I get all the way to the edge. So I'm almost at the edge now. I just need to do another row of stitching to fill in that last gap. And the blanket stitch is such a flexible stitch that it's going to be really easy to adjust the height and length of those stitches to fill in that area. So there it is, all filled in. So now that the stitching of the bird in the background is complete, I'm going to look at these edges. And I want to tidy them up, and a nice way to do that is to blanket stitch on the edges. So this is the same stitch. I'm just doing it around the edge of the fabric. I'm using white for this, and I'm going to work my way all around the piece, tucking under those edges of fabric as I go. So now all those edges are folded under. I'm turning my attention to the way that the whole piece is looking. The bird and the background. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline this bird by filling in that first row of blanket stitching with a satin stitch. So I'm going to start over here where there's this area of red. I'm going to go back and forth in that little box, filling it in, and then I'm going to move to the next box and fill that in. I think that's going to add a really nice visual touch to the bird. And as well, it's going to delineate it from the background. So that pattern with the red is going to be in the bird's head, but not in the background. So I'm going to continue doing this all around the bird. I'm going to fill in every box with the satin stitch. So I've gone all around the head and part of the throat of the bird. And I've decided that I'm going to stop there. That blue and green striped fabric comes right up into the chest of the bird, so it's not adding any kind of visual distraction. So I don't think that any satin stitch is needed there. This has almost added a halo effect to the bird, and I'm really liking the way that that looks. So now I'm turning to my border and my edging, and I've decided that I want to add some cording. I've pulled out this red color because there's a small amount of red in the head and on the chest of the bird, and this color matches really well. So I'm going to couch this on. I've chosen a matching color of floss. I'm going to cut a piece that's slightly larger all around, and I'm going to couch this on using the blanket stitch with one small variation. I'm going to start here down at the corner. I'm going to blanket stitch around that cording. So every 2 or 3 stitches, instead of going around the cording, I'm going to take my needle up through the cording. So I'm going to put my needle down into the side of my piece, come up through that cording and out the top and complete that blanket stitch. And that's going to help attach it. So I take a few regular blanket stitches, and then I go right through the cording instead of around it, and I continue this way all the way around. When I get back to where I started, I'm going to take that extra edge and tuck it underneath and behind, and then I'm going to take those stitches right through the cording to help pull it into the other piece. And if I pull and tighten it down, it's going to become almost seamless, that join. So I'm going through, pulling it down, and then I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to stitch that edge to the back to hold that in place and then tie off. So there's my edging. I'm really happy with the way that that's looking. Now you could have done this with black floss, and then you would have had a black and white border, and that would look really nice as well. And when I take the black floss and I put it right at the edge where it's meeting, I think that's adding a nice second border. So what I'm going to do is come in with black floss, and I'm going to stitch right along that edge where the red cording is stitched on. I'm going to use the back stitch, and I'm going to go all the way around, adding that black. That's added a really nice subtle effect of a black and white border, and it's looking really nice. I'm really happy with the way this has turned out. So I hope this has inspired you to try spiraling blanket stitch. There's so many options. You can cover an entire collage working in a circular motion, or you can work around a defined shape like this bird. You can change colors, you can use one color, there's so many options. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, happy stitching.